on a freezing Christmas night in 1776, as the American Revolution seemed on the verge of collapse. General George Washington led 2,400 desperate men across the ice-choked Delaware River in a blinding snowstorm. Most military experts believed the rebellion was already lost, that the ragtag Continental Army would disintegrate within weeks, and that the greatest experiment in self-government would die before it truly began. What happened in the next 72 hours would change the course of human history and prove that determined men fighting for freedom could defeat the world's most powerful empire.
The seeds of rebellion. The American Revolution did not begin with a single dramatic event, but emerged from tensions that had been building for more than a decade. The British Empire in the 1760s was the world's dominant power, having just won the 7 Years' War against France, a global conflict that had secured British control of North America east of the Mississippi River. But victory came at enormous cost. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled, and Parliament looked to its American colonies to help pay for their own defense and administration. The American colonists, numbering approximately 2.5 million people spread along the Atlantic coast from Georgia to Massachusetts, had enjoyed considerable autonomy for generations. They elected their own assemblies, managed their own affairs, and generally paid minimal taxes to the Crown. Most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects, proud of their English heritage and their place within the empire. But they also cherished the practical independence they had developed over 150 years of limited Crown oversight. Parliament's attempts to raise revenue from the colonies, the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, sparked resistance that surprised British authorities. Colonial leaders argued that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies without their representation in that body. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, though the colonists' position was more complex than this simple slogan suggested. They questioned the fundamental nature of their relationship with Britain and the extent of Parliament's authority over internal colonial affairs. The tensions escalated through a series of confrontations. The Boston Massacre of 1770, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of civilians, killing 5, became a propaganda triumph for colonial radicals who portrayed it as evidence of British tyranny. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, where colonists dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act, demonstrated that resistance had moved beyond rhetoric to direct action. Britain's response, the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and imposed direct military rule. These punitive measures, intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, instead unified the colonies in opposition. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together delegates from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance. But even in 1774, few colonists sought independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, a return to the previous relationship where they enjoyed substantial autonomy while acknowledging the king's sovereignty. Independence was a radical position advocated by a small minority. The colonists wanted their rights as Englishmen restored, not to cease being English altogether.
The shot heard round the world. The transition from political resistance to armed rebellion occurred with shocking suddenness. In April 1775, British General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, received orders to arrest colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock and to seize military stores that colonists had been accumulating in Concord, a town about 20 miles from Boston. On the night of April 18th, approximately 700 British soldiers marched from Boston toward Concord. Colonial intelligence networks, including the famous midnight rides of Paul Revere and William Dawes, warned the countryside of the British approach. When the British arrived at Lexington Common at dawn on April 19th, they found about 70 colonial militiamen formed up to oppose them. What happened next remains unclear. Both sides later claimed the other fired first, but shots were exchanged, and when the brief skirmish ended, 8 colonists lay dead and another 9 wounded. The British continued to Concord, destroyed some military supplies, but were then forced to retreat back to Boston under constant fire from colonial militiamen who had gathered by the thousands. The British retreat became a nightmare, with redcoats being shot at from behind walls, trees, and houses by an enemy they could rarely see. By the time the battered British column reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties against approximately 95 colonial losses. The battles of Lexington and Concord transformed the political crisis into armed conflict. Thousands of colonial militia surrounded Boston, besieging the British garrison. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in May 1775, found itself coordinating what was effectively a war, despite still hoping for reconciliation. The Congress appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, as commander-in-chief of what would become the Continental Army. Washington was an inspired choice. His military experience, imposing physical presence, and character commanded respect, and his Virginia origins helped unite the colonies since leadership came from outside rebellious Massachusetts. The Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, demonstrated both colonial determination and their military limitations. Colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston, and withstood 2 British frontal assaults before running out of ammunition and being forced to retreat. The British captured the position, but at horrific cost, more than 1,000 casualties out of 2,400 engaged, including a disproportionate number of officers. As one British officer observed, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. Yet even after Bunker Hill, as the siege of Boston continued through 1775, many colonists still hoped to avoid independence. It seemed impossible. How could 13 colonies defeat the British Empire? Britain possessed the world's most powerful navy, a professional army, vast financial resources, and the ability to hire mercenaries from Europe. The colonies had no navy, no professional army, no manufacturing base for weapons, and no functioning national government.
The decisive break. The psychological break from Britain came gradually through 1775 and early 1776. King George III's proclamation in August 1775 that the colonies were in rebellion and that the rebels would be crushed militarily ended hopes that Parliament was the problem, while the king would protect colonial rights. The hiring of German mercenaries, the notorious Hessians, to fight in America outraged colonists, who saw it as the king making war on his own subjects. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, crystallized the case for independence. Written in plain language, accessible to common people rather than the educated elite, Paine argued that independence was not just politically necessary, but morally right. He attacked the concept of monarchy itself, questioned why a continent should be ruled by an island, and presented independence as inevitable and natural. Common Sense became an immediate bestseller, circulating throughout the colonies and converting thousands to the independence cause. By June 1776, sentiment had shifted decisively.
The Continental Congress debated independence, with Virginia's Richard Henry Lee introducing a resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. Thomas Jefferson, a brilliant 33-year-old Virginia lawyer, drafted the formal Declaration of Independence, which Congress adopted on July 4, 1776. The Declaration was a revolutionary document in every sense. It proclaimed that all men are created equal and possessed unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It asserted that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that failed to protect their rights. These principles, which seem obvious today, were radical in 1776, when most of the world was governed by hereditary monarchies claiming divine authority. But declaring independence and achieving it were entirely different matters. The Americans faced the task of defeating the world's greatest military power with an army that barely existed.
Valley Forge and the Crisis of Confidence. The early war years from 1776 through 1777 nearly destroyed the American cause. Washington's Continental Army, never numbering more than about 20,000 men and often far fewer, faced the full weight of British military might. British forces captured New York City in summer and fall 1776, inflicting a series of defeats that sent Washington's army fleeing across New Jersey. By December 1776, the situation was desperate. Washington's army had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 men, cold, hungry, poorly equipped, and demoralized by constant defeat. Many soldiers' enlistments would expire on December 31st, and few seemed likely to re-enlist. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, fearing British capture. The Revolution appeared finished. Washington understood that only dramatic action could save the cause. On Christmas night, 1776, he executed one of military history's most audacious operations, ferrying his army across the ice-choked Delaware River during a blinding snowstorm to attack Hessian forces at Trenton, New Jersey. The crossing was nightmarish, taking 9 hours longer than planned, with men and artillery hauled across in boats, while ice floes threatened to capsize them. The attack at dawn on December 26th achieved complete surprise. The Hessians, recovering from Christmas celebrations, were overwhelmed. Washington captured nearly 1,000 prisoners while suffering only 4 American casualties, 2 from combat, 2 frozen to death during the march. The victory was small in military terms, but psychologically enormous. It proved the Continental Army could win, revived patriot morale, and encouraged re-enlistments. Washington followed up by defeating British forces at Princeton on January 3, 1777, further restoring American confidence. These victories didn't change the strategic situation. The British still controlled New York and New Jersey, but they kept the revolution alive when it seemed about to collapse. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, tested American resolve more severely than any battle. Washington's army, approximately 12,000 men, encamped 20 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia. The conditions were horrific. Inadequate food, clothing, and shelter, diseases spreading through the crowded camp, temperatures below freezing for weeks. Approximately 2,000 men died that winter from disease, exposure, and starvation. Sick, discontented, and out of humor, Washington wrote to Congress, describing his army's condition. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. Yet Valley Forge also marked a turning point.
Baron Friedrich Steuben, a Prussian military officer who volunteered to train the Continental Army, instituted systematic drill and discipline that transformed the force from an armed mob into a professional army capable of standing toe-to-toe with British regulars. The training conducted that winter would prove decisive in battles to come.
The American victory at Saratoga in October 1777, where General Horatio Gates forced British General John Burgoyne to surrender an entire army of 6,000 men, proved to European powers that the Americans could win significant battles. This convinced France, Britain's longtime enemy, to openly ally with the Americans, a decision that fundamentally changed the war's dynamics. The Franco-American alliance, formalized in February 1778, provided the Americans with what they desperately needed: a powerful navy to challenge British naval supremacy, money and supplies to sustain the war effort, and the prospect of French military forces fighting alongside American troops. Britain now faced a global war against multiple enemies, forcing it to divert resources from America to defend possessions in the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere. The psychological impact was equally important. France's recognition of American independence as a sovereign nation provided international legitimacy to the revolution and demonstrated that the Americans weren't merely rebels, but a legitimate government fighting for national survival. The war shifted southward in 1778 to 1780, as British strategy focused on conquering the southern colonies where they believed loyalist support was strongest. British forces captured Savannah and Charleston, inflicting a major defeat when Charleston's garrison of 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered, the worst American defeat of the war. But British success in capturing territory didn't translate to controlling it. American guerrilla forces, led by commanders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, waged brutal partisan warfare that disrupted British supply lines and administration. The British discovered that occupying cities was easy, but controlling the countryside was impossible when the population was hostile.
The road to Yorktown. By 1781, Britain faced an impossible strategic situation. Its forces held several major cities, but couldn't suppress resistance in the countryside. The costs of the war were enormous and increasingly unpopular in Britain. The entry of Spain and the Netherlands into the war against Britain stretched resources to the breaking point. British General Lord Cornwallis, commanding forces in the South, moved into Virginia in 1781, believing he could strike decisive blows there that would end the rebellion. He established a base at Yorktown, a tobacco port on the York River, planning to receive supplies by sea and use it as a base for operations. It was a fatal mistake. Washington, coordinating with French General Rochambeau, recognized an opportunity. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay. If that fleet could achieve temporary naval superiority and prevent British ships from resupplying Cornwallis, and if American and French ground forces could move quickly enough to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown before he could escape, the British Southern Army could be captured. The operation required perfect timing and coordination between forces hundreds of miles apart. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined armies more than 400 miles from New York to Virginia in late summer 1781. De Grasse's fleet defeated a British naval force in the Battle of the Chesapeake on September 5th, establishing French control of the waters around Yorktown. By late September, approximately 17,000 American and French troops had surrounded Cornwallis's 8,000-man garrison. With no prospect of relief or escape, Cornwallis was trapped.
The Allies conducted a formal siege, digging parallels, trenches that gradually approached the British fortifications and bombarding the British positions with heavy artillery. The siege lasted 3 weeks, with the British position becoming increasingly hopeless as French ships prevented escape by sea and the Allied noose tightened on land. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. As British troops marched out to lay down their arms, their bands played "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting tune for an event that seemed impossible when the rebellion began.
The Long Peace and a New Nation. Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations, though the war didn't officially end until the Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783. Britain recognized American independence and ceded territory from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, an enormous expanse that would allow the new nation to expand westward. The American victory was one of history's greatest upsets. A loose coalition of 13 colonies with no professional army, no navy, and limited resources had defeated the world's most powerful empire. The victory resulted from multiple factors: British strategic mistakes and overextension, French assistance that provided crucial naval support, superior American knowledge of terrain and ability to conduct guerrilla warfare, British inability to crush resistance in the vast American territory, and most importantly, American determination to continue fighting despite repeated defeats. But winning independence was only the beginning. The Articles of Confederation, under which the colonies had coordinated during the war, created a weak national government that struggled to address post-war challenges. Economic depression, interstate disputes, and the inability to raise revenue nearly caused the new nation to collapse before it could consolidate its independence. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 created a new framework of government, the U.S. Constitution, that balanced state and federal authority while establishing a government strong enough to be effective, but constrained enough to protect individual liberty. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, created the governmental structure that, with amendments, still governs the United States today.
The Revolutionary Legacy. The American Revolution's significance extends far beyond American independence. It was the first successful colonial rebellion against a European power and demonstrated that colonies could throw off imperial control. It was the first revolution fought explicitly for Enlightenment principles of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and government by consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal with unalienable rights established a standard that the nation would struggle for centuries to live up to, but which provided a foundation for eventual expansion of rights and equality. The revolution's rhetoric of liberty and rights inspired subsequent revolutions, most immediately the French Revolution, but also independence movements and democratic reforms worldwide over the following centuries. Yet the revolution also revealed contradictions that would haunt America. The same men who proclaimed human equality and natural rights often owned slaves. The revolution did little to improve the status of women, who remained legally subordinate to men. Native Americans found that American independence meant accelerated expansion into their territories. These contradictions would eventually lead to a civil war and ongoing struggles over civil rights that continue to the present. The men who fought in the Continental Army experienced extraordinary hardships: inadequate food, clothing, and shelter, irregular pay that was often worthless due to inflation, disease that killed more soldiers than combat, and the constant risk of death or maiming in battle. Many veterans received little or nothing for their service, returning home to farms or businesses that had suffered during their absence. Washington, who could have made himself king or dictator given his enormous prestige, instead voluntarily resigned his commission and returned to private life, an act that astonished European observers accustomed to revolutionary generals seizing power. His precedent of civilian control over the military and peaceful transfer of power became fundamental to American democracy. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years, from the shots at Lexington in April 1775 to the Treaty of Paris in September 1783. Approximately 25,000 Americans died, about 8,000 in battle and the rest from disease or other causes, out of a population of 2.5 million. As a proportion of the population, it was one of America's deadliest wars. The economic cost was enormous, leaving states deeply in debt and disrupting trade and commerce for years. But the result was the creation of the United States of America, a nation founded on revolutionary principles that would grow to become a global power while continuing to struggle with living up to its founding ideals. The experiment in Republican government that began in 1776 survived its difficult birth, and the nation created by the Revolution would eventually fulfill the founders' hope that America would be, in Washington's words, a beacon of hope and freedom for people around the world. The American Revolutionary War was not just a military conflict, but a political, social, and ideological revolution that challenged fundamental assumptions about government, rights, and human potential. The soldiers who endured Valley Forge, crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, and fought at Yorktown were creating not just a new nation, but a new vision of how nations could be organized and governed. Their sacrifice and determination established a country that, for all its flaws and failures, represented something genuinely new in human affairs. Government based on the revolutionary principle that legitimate authority comes from the consent of the governed rather than divine right or inherited privilege. More than 2 centuries later, the revolutionary generation's achievement remains impressive. They created enduring institutions, established principles that continue to inspire, and proved that people fighting for freedom and self-government could defeat seemingly impossible odds. The American Revolution demonstrated that determined resistance could overcome even the most powerful empire, that new nations could be born through struggle and sacrifice, and that the ideals of liberty and equality, however imperfectly realized, possessed power that transcended the limitations of any particular time or place.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so we can keep creating more content.